Hi, I'm Dan Rickards. I'm Head of Cloud Strategy here at Telefónica Tech, and today I'm very glad to be joined by James Hall, the Head of GreenOps at GreenPixie, talking about what is GreenOps, why it matters, and why IT leaders need to start taking cloud sustainability seriously. James, thank you so much for joining us. Do you want to sort of give yourself a bit of a brief introduction?
Yeah, absolutely. So at GreenPixie, we found the problem that needed solving most to really kick GreenOps off in earnest was actually, it wasn't so much the best practices or, really, I guess, defining, what the business value of sustainability is, but more like, particularly in public cloud, which is where we focus. The problem was a lack of data and a lack of transparency and a lot of analysis paralysis. People are waiting for the perfect data. The cloud providers give you some, but, marking your own homework, the lack of transparency from their data is really kind of caused a lot of people to not really take GreenOps that seriously. But we found giving people accurate, transparent data that matches their use cases is really the key to driving GreenOps. So we're a data provider that works on the methodology to do those calculations and create that visibility.
Yeah, amazing. I think for me, from a GreenOps perspective, I think it's quite an exciting time for GreenOps. I think we're seeing a lot of sustained investment in data centers. I think the latest Gartner piece of analysis is, data center investment for 2025 is up 40% year on year compared to last year. So we're seeing a lot of investment into data centers. We're seeing a lot of organizations, whether they're technology companies or service providers or other organizations investing in data centers. But obviously the silent constraint here that people aren't maybe yet aware of is grid capacity. I think there's been a few pieces of research coming out where the connections into the national grid, organizations are facing long delays to connect up these data centers. Some cases they're having to wait up to 15 years just to connect the data centers. So yes, we're seeing a hell of a lot of investment into AI and into data centers, but if that constraint of grid capacity is a problem that we can't quite solve yet, fundamentally we might not actually see the value of those investments just yet.
Yeah, well, I think as we're seeing, money is becoming less of the problem, and it's more the actual resources. I work with customers now who have had to halt some of their migrations to Azure and AWS just because the data centers aren't big enough, there aren't enough servers, there's not enough grid capacity. And we're not able to build new data centers, as you said, because of grid capacity, lack of infrastructure. But I mean, as more businesses kind of move towards digitization and more startups are pure SaaS and digital, the electricity is going to become the deciding factor, which is, I think, an exciting time for GreenOps because, although there's a lot of cost savings in GreenOps, it's all about efficiency and getting more bang for your buck, not from the dollar, but actually from the kilowatt hours you're using. And if you can, if you optimize the kilowatt hours you're using, then you can get more from a single server and more from a data center.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think we saw that in COVID, right? There was a capacity issue with Azure during COVID, and some people struggled to do migrations into UK South and UK West because of that. So this idea that there's almost like an infinite supply of compute and an infinite supply of electricity in the UK, I'm not sure that is the reality. I think that a lot of organizations are sort of starting to wake up to that. I think they've almost gone through the first wave of GreenOps with essentially FinOps, and we've seen huge adoption of FinOps over the last 2 to 3 years, where organizations are piling in when it comes to buying tools, to building FinOps teams, and to driving FinOps out as an organizational capability, because they're suffering from the problem of cloud spend. And I think over the next couple of years, as you sort of said, more and more organizations will start to wake up and take notice of GreenOps as well. I'm keen to get your thoughts on this as well, but from the organizations that we're working with, I'm sort of seeing two user personas in the GreenOps space at the moment. The first are those organizations where sustainability is a highly visible and highly valuable priority for them, their organizational identity maybe is rooted in doing the right thing. Maybe they're public sector, maybe they provide critical services to members of society, but they have a strong sense of identity that they must do the right thing as a firm. And those organizations are starting to lean into GreenOps early compared to others because they want to make sure that they are wholly responsible and fully cognitive as to the scope of their cloud emissions. They want to be able to measure it, they want to be able to report on it, and they want to make sure that when they're putting out their annual statement, they're covering all of their scope 3 emissions. And we're starting to work with some of those organizations. It's really exciting for me to get hands-on with GreenOps data and GreenOps frameworks with those organizations. And we're definitely seeing some customers waking up to the fact that their cloud emissions are actually higher than they thought they might be. Maybe when they migrated, sustainability was just viewed as a nice win as part of that cloud migration, that yes, we've now off on-prem and so we're on cloud and so we're automatically more sustainable. And the reality of that is maybe slightly different.
Yeah, I mean, there's a common narrative from the cloud providers that, you know, you'll reduce your carbon by 99% if you do it in the cloud. And I think there's multiple reasons they do that. And there's no denying the cloud is more efficient because they've got the economies of scale. The power usage effectiveness of a cloud data center can be anywhere from like 1.09 up to like 1.2, and your typical on-premise data center you're looking at 1.2 plus. So there is definitely electricity gains to be had and carbon gains, but it's not 99% because like the approach they take is to use the market-based approach, which is typically including things like renewable energy certificates. So if you've invested £1 million in a wind farm in Sweden, you can now say, oh, my Texas data center is carbon neutral. But I think the reason for that is ultimately for a hyperscaler, you want people to be using your data centers evenly. So if you start telling people Frankfurt is 10 times more carbon intense than Sweden, you're going to be affecting user decisions, and they'll start moving to
supply and demand, right?
Yeah, they'll start moving all their workloads to regions where the capacity will run out here, but then you have empty data centers elsewhere. So I can understand why they choose to.
It's challenging.
Report it as such.
It's challenging. I think we're also starting to see some of the hyperscalers almost go further down the value chain. And I know we sort of mentioned grid capacity issues earlier, but some of the hyperscalers, Azure, GCP, and Amazon are now going further down the value chain and actually investing in their own energy capacity and energy generation. There was a story, I think, about a year or so ago about GCP building almost mini nuclear reactors to power some of their data centers because they need a steady supply of energy into their data centers to make sure that they can enable their customers to get the service levels they associate with the public cloud. They can't have outages into that data center. So it's really interesting that though the hyperscalers are now really investing in energy and they're taking this really seriously and they are going much further down the value chain because yes, previously it was the job of the national grid and they would just hook up, but now that they're facing those capacity issues, they're having to pivot their data center strategy to make sure that there is the adequate capacity for them to continue scaling and continue their investments in data centers and in cloud and in AI as well.
Yeah, I mean, it goes to show that they also see that electricity is the problem.
Yeah.
But I mean, building nuclear reactors it's considered a low carbon technology, but that's when you start thinking about water and other resources because you might be able to build your own electricity plant next to your data center, but the water needs to come from somewhere. And typically we see data centers popping up where the land is cheap, in like the middle of the desert or in water scarce areas. So you start seeing, water getting taken away from local communities and local wildlife. So even if it is carbon neutral because of your power plant or because of some renewable energy certificates, that water is going to be a new scarce resource.
And I think we spoke earlier about, you can't improve what you can't measure, right? And that's why just starting with GreenOps is arguably the hardest thing to do, to just get building in terms of reporting capabilities, in terms of data sets, and just get hands-on and start sort of pushing out metrics for people to start paying attention to.
I think I said earlier, the thing that stops GreenOps a lot is people waiting for that perfect data set. But we have a concept of the GreenOps flywheel, which is really, well, step one is just like understanding the basics of GreenOps. You don't need to have like a degree in climate science to understand that servers use electricity, and electricity requires water, and then depending on the technology used, there's a certain carbon impact of that electricity. But also it's about understanding what good data and bad data looks like, and then finding the data that fits your use case. It's similar with FinOps. You don't roll out FinOps to every single application team in one go. You kind of focus somewhere first. Is it one application? Is it one right sizing piece? Is it like a tagging policy you're trying to get in place? And then using that as a lighthouse to help influence the rest. And it's the same with GreenOps. Just having a data set that helps your initial use case. If you're trying to implement something like intelligent tiering, you just need data that is able to distinguish between frequent access storage gigabytes and archive storage gigabytes. And that can be enough to get started with understanding the impact of these FinOps initiatives, and not just doing the cost-benefit analysis of these things, but adding the carbon benefit analysis. And then like one of the main impacts of GreenOps we see is really getting people to care about efficiency. We spoke about personas earlier. One of the key ones, particularly in cloud, is those engineers who make the decisions day to day. Like you do get some technical FinOps people who'll go in and do a right sizing for you, but if you're in an enterprise with a team of 1,000 engineers working on lots of applications, you can't have that many FinOps people doing it. You need to show them the data at the time of the decision, help them understand, and then the FinOps GreenOps persona becomes more of a storyteller.
Efficiency persona.
And just how do you convince them that efficiency is important when maybe cost saving isn't the top of their priority list, but how do you turn it from a business incentive into a personal incentive? I think that's where GreenOps really shines. No,
I definitely agree with that. I think we work with some organisations who have a central FinOps team who have to go out and interface into decentralised application teams or business teams running their own applications, and it is hard to get adoption of FinOps. If it's a central budget and these teams, there's no penalty for them running inefficient workloads because they're only ever showed their cost, then they're actually charged for it. It's really hard to get adoption to really drive the optimization within those applications, and GreenOps is a really nice way of almost flipping the narrative and getting that buy-in and trying to gamify it in a way that efficiency is something that can be shared communally. Everyone has to buy into that because in a sense, there is, as we said, there's only so much electricity to go around, and so sustainability is everyone's job. And I think where maybe FinOps teams have struggled in a decentralized model to go and get that adoption just by driving cost metrics, actually infusing sustainability metrics helps drive that adoption and get uptick with those decentralized teams. Yeah, I do like to think of GreenOps as like kind of gamification on steroids, basically. And I also have been known to call it a bit of a Trojan horse, where you're essentially tricking engineers into doing FinOps by just like changing up the metrics you're using. But to convince an engineer that this data is worth actioning, it needs to be trusted. They need to be able to understand where the data is coming from. And I think it's obviously the accuracy of the data is important, but I actually think the transparency of it is 10 times more important, because who's to say what the true value of the carbon electricity is? Like, there's about 1 million ways to work out what a total CO2 number is. Many of them are like global standards, but one methodology will give you 1 million tons, one will give you 0 tons. Both of them are accepted in your ESG reporting. So I think really digging into the transparency and being able to understand exactly where these numbers are coming from, and then being able to see, I made a change, and this is where... I think that timeliness is so important as well. I think we've seen a massive evolution in the capability of GreenOps data sets and GreenOps tooling to actually provide as close to real time as you can get. And we've definitely, I've worked with organisations where it's really challenging to even give them emissions metrics because you're waiting on a 30-day rolling basis to get them. And so, yes, you're providing them with maybe a CO2e number or a kilowatt hour or a water consumption, but because you're having to wait 30 days to then update that, any optimizations they're going to make from an efficiency point of view, they're not actually going to see. And so that gamification flywheel to incentivize people to take action just sort of breaks, because if you're making changes and you're trying to do the right thing by making your cloud applications more efficient, but you're seeing no benefit from doing so, it can become really you can become really demotivated quite quickly. And so I think, to add to your point, like the timeliness of that GreenOps data is so important. Making sure that you have some form of API that you can either integrate into whatever dashboard that those application teams are using, or whether you integrate it into their existing FinOps tool or cost dashboard or anything. If you can turn it into another currency, so as and when they're making changes, they can see the payback for those changes, you're far more likely to get adoption from those application teams. The other thing I think on that is, we're definitely seeing an evolution where the responsibilities of traditional FinOps teams are evolving. They're having to take on more work into the GreenOps space, into the cloud sustainability space. And I think it's really easy to just assume that this is something that every FinOps team can easily transition to doing, when in reality you do have to take a step back and realize that you're asking a FinOps team to work with a brand new currency in cloud emissions, and it's a brand new language for those teams. And so you need to make sure that you're also investing in that team to give them the right training, to give them the right skills and the right opportunities, because you're almost doubling their workload. They're no longer having to just talk to the application teams, the engineering teams, and finance, and working very cross-functional in that nature. They're potentially now having to go over to ESG teams as well, and having to translate IT or cloud into ESG teams who maybe haven't had any exposure. And some of the organizations that I'm working with, for a lot of those FinOps teams or IT teams, this is actually the first time that they're collaborating or interfacing with the ESG department. And so you are having to bridge the gap and translate technical realities into emissions standards to give those ESG teams the confidence they need to go and report on their carbon data or their emissions data or their water data as part of their net zero ambitions or as part of their annual company reports. And so that evolution of the FinOps team, from an operating model perspective, it can't be overlooked. If you're an IT director and you're deciding that, now I want to make sure that GreenOps is a metric that we take seriously, yes, it probably sits with the FinOps team to adopt that and take responsibility for that. But it's not just another cloud service for them to think about or another resource for them to optimize. It is a brand new language, and so you need to teach them and you need to help them with that adoption curve, because sort of as you said, to build that GreenOps flywheel, you need to start somewhere, and maybe GreenOps certification is the first point of call. Yeah,
well, a few things to say about that. I think we realize that currently the FinOps data set and your typical ESG data set are completely incompatible. Yeah. Because the level of detail you go to for FinOps is so different to what an ESG team is required to do. Well, I mean, I always like to think of cost and usage data. If you're getting raw cost and usage data, you are just getting a hose pipe of information. Yeah. And if you're unfamiliar with that and you're trying to make sense of it, it's really hard. And then exactly as you said, if you compare that, where I've worked with ESG teams where their emissions reporting across scope 1, 2 and 3 is all being done out of Excel, and they just want one single number to put in the cloud box, and that's all they want. And so you can come in and you almost over-engineer it, because you go, great, which region do you want? Which services do you want? Which applications do you want? Do you want CO2? Do you want kilowatt hour? How do you want to sort of start dividing up these numbers? And they're looking at you as if, what are you talking about? I just need the cloud number. I need the cloud number for this quarter to put it in the spreadsheet so I can put it on the company report. And just the reality of that interaction, I think we're only starting to see that happening inside of a lot of organizations. Yeah, when you do the FinOps practitioner course, they'll teach you that the data is not human readable. Yeah. There are 8 million SKUs, more than 8 million different unique SKUs or usage types across the 3 cloud providers. Each of them has its own unique price, and many of them have their own unique impact on electricity, carbon and water. So even AWS EC2, for example, you might think, compute, compute hours, I can make a number for that. But actually EC2 is made up of more than 1 million SKUs that covers networking, storage, platform as a service, compute, multiple different...
Where do you draw the line? Like, where do you draw the line? Like, if you're going to say, we're just going to report on compute, it's like, okay, you're just going to like ignore everything that's required to run the compute instance, and then what are you going to do with all of the networking or the disks, or how are you going to factor that in? And I think ESG teams, they just don't have the cloud skills to be able to then start creating those lines of demarcation between cloud reporting and emissions reporting. And that is where there's a massive opportunity for FinOps people to evolve into that space, to not only translate finance or cloud finance into engineering teams, but now start translating cloud emissions into ESG teams.
Yeah, well, that's why I think if you're able to give the FinOps team a leg up with data that is at least somewhat familiar to them, which is where the carbon as a currency piece comes in. Everything has a unit price, and then the mission at GreenPixie is to make sure everything has a unit carbon as well. So if you're making a decision about which SKU to use, AMD or Intel, you would say, per hour of usage, AMD is slightly cheaper. And then cross-reference that with, and the unit carbon is also cheaper. And then, so that is how you can start making smarter decisions, basically.
I know you guys have been doing some really cool work with MasterCard. Obviously, announced them as a winner at your at Green.io for one of your inaugural GreenPixie awards. How's that going?
Yeah, well, you mentioned earlier certain enterprises really hold sustainability as a strategic investment for them. And MasterCard is one of those people. And I think it comes from the top and the grassroots campaign, because it is the C-suite really take it seriously there, particularly for their on-prem and cloud. And they're a technology company, so cloud and IT is a huge part of their footprint, but also has a lot of opportunity. And I think that the fact they take sustainability so seriously means they attract the best talent who also take sustainability seriously. So that means no matter who you're talking to there, we work closely with the FinOps teams, and then more broadly working to align that with what they're doing with their on-premise, so their IT sustainability team as well. And they're all extremely bought in. And we're seeing the results are speaking for themselves, really. We were able to set a carbon target with them, and now optimizing against that carbon target, we're seeing faster cost savings, and actually being able to set a cloud emissions reduction goal for 2025, and now on track to exceed that. So they're an excellent case study for it.
And it's amazing. I think one thing that I always find really interesting is the first time you bring GreenOps into an organization, where do you start? And I think we spoke about this before we started recording, in terms of analysis paralysis and the inertia organizations face sometimes when attempting new things, and that sort of divide between, do we try and measure and optimize what we've already got deployed, or do we prioritize anything net new being designed, and we actually try, and one of our GreenOps principles or cloud strategy principles is going to be sustainable by design. What do you think, if you had to choose and say, if you were facing GreenOps for the first time as a head of GreenOps inside of an enterprise, would you tackle trying to optimize the existing cloud applications and cloud resources, or would you start by sort of tackling the net new builds?
Well, I mean, in that conversation, you said yourself, it's about the trade-off of what's easy to implement and what has the biggest cost impact for FinOps. And I think what all GreenOps does is add a third point to that weighting of how easy is it to implement, what's the cost impact, what's the carbon impact of this, to make it I think there already is an iron triangle, making it the iron square of decision making. So it really depends on what that architecture is. But when I'm looking at how to create your first GreenOps business case, one of the shortcomings that people do is make it a whole new initiative. Let's reduce our carbon by 12% or something, and just set that target and add it to someone's to-do list. But what you really need to do is look at the list of initiatives you're already doing and what can be accelerated by GreenOps. Are you looking to set new policies for future things to help cut costs and like avoid cost in the first place, because right-sizing everything you've already done is too difficult. Can you use GreenOps data to help make engineers make that decision better, more naturally, make them care more about the initiatives? Or are you in the middle of a migration or digital transformation or modernization that's kind of lagging because you're not getting enough buy-in, or people aren't putting it to the top of their priority list to refactor this application? Can you use the GreenOps carbon benefit analysis to get people to accelerate this adoption?
Yeah.
And I think, FinOps is a great beachhead because the typical actions that are associated with FinOps in public cloud have such a huge overlap with things that would reduce electricity and carbon and water, that we typically start there because there's so many use cases that they're probably working on right now that will have GreenOps. But we can go in from like the sustainability angle, where they've got like a scope 3 reduction target that they need to hit, and that would associate with like reducing public cloud, or the IT sustainability team who are looking to I don't know, finish off a migration and save electricity or something. So it's really about
I've worked on migrations previously where I wrote almost like the cloud business case and cloud migration strategy, and when you sort of go through your traditional workshops with customers, and you find out that from an on-prem perspective they're having to buy in during the summer months diesel generators to fuel the air conditioning units to keep their data center cool. And you start factoring those sorts of investments into the migration business case to go, actually, if you do migrate these applications to public cloud, you no longer have to go off and drive around London trying to buy diesel. That's just not your problem anymore. And so there's definitely times where sustainability in a really pure sense, just from that example, makes a massive difference, because it opens people's eyes to, oh my gosh, from an organizational priority perspective, adopting public cloud is going to help us in more ways than we maybe initially realized. Yes, we get the benefits of a public cloud platform. We can deploy really cool applications, and we get this massive treasure chest of different services to build with, and we can just automate everything. Everything's basically deployed by code, so our time to value is super, super short. But you then start letting them know that actually, we can now give you really, really insightful, timely, accurate and meaningful sustainability metrics to help then further incentivize your engineers to continue to do the right thing. It's like, oh my gosh, okay, wow, let's have that conversation. And I think FinOps, it has exploded over the last 2 to 3 years. There's no doubt about that. But I do think that GreenOps is the next logical step for those FinOps teams, is to now start looking at it and saying, okay, we've maybe hit the point where our tagging taxonomy is in a really healthy place, and any new resources are tagged efficiently. We've got up-to-date and accurate cost dashboards which report on a rolling daily basis. We've got really nice levels of rate and usage optimization. And you maybe hit that period where you go, we've pretty much done everything that's could be considered easy or fairly straightforward and simple. And now they're looking at the next level of optimizations for their applications. And I think, as you sort of mentioned, that efficiency metric matters more to engineers when it's both cost and sustainability. So I guess if you're listening to us talk about sustainability, and I love talking about cloud. I can talk about cloud for days. But if you have the unfortunate pleasure of stumbling across this video on LinkedIn and you're thinking, okay, cool, I want to get started in GreenOps, where would your advice be to start?
Yeah, well, in the GreenOps flywheel that we've coined, the first step is really just having a kind of fundamental knowledge of, well, I'm sure many people know what the cloud is, but why it consumes electricity, why there's carbon associated to it, why there's water associated to it, and how this data can actually help you. And we found ourselves having that conversation 10 times a day with different customers. So we've actually built what we call the GreenOps Academy, essentially to the Cloud Sustainability Fundamentals course, to essentially get you up to that first notch of knowledge, so then you can understand, what does good data look like, what does bad data look like, what can my first sustainability GreenOps use case be in the cloud. And then once you find that use case, it's about, how do I find the right data to help me with that use case. And so that's where GreenPixie come in. We're a GreenOps data source for people who are looking to get the best, most nuanced data they can. But if what you're trying to do is migrate from a R5X large to an R5 large, data that is able to cover the differences between those two SKUs is a great place to start. But when it gets more nuanced around different types of NAT gateways or different storage tiers, you might need to start looking at other methodologies or commercially available methodologies like ours to help you with those use cases. But you don't need to get the perfect data from day one. You just need data that matches your use case and the knowledge of how to use it to drive a change.
From a Telefónica Tech perspective as well, we've launched our GreenOps offering into our customers. We have a unique consulting approach whereby we're working with the likes of GreenPixie to take emissions data and using our Propel methodology rapidly convert that into a meaningful output for our customers, whether that's a real-time emissions dashboard, whether that's a customized cloud sustainability report to give over to their board from an ESG or a net zero perspective, or whether that's helping them to convert raw emissions data into meaningful efficiency metrics to help influence their engineers to take action. I think GreenOps is an exciting time for us here at Telefónica Tech because a lot of our customers are waking up to the reality that cloud sustainability is something they need to take seriously, and we're seeing massive uptake from our customers in terms of just asking about it compared to maybe a year or two ago when GreenOps wasn't on anyone's radar. So from an AI perspective as well, it's quite interesting because from a FinOps perspective, when people talk about AI and FinOps, I think there's almost two use cases. There's FinOps for AI and there's AI in FinOps. And I think the same applies to GreenOps. There's AI in GreenOps to help you take emissions data and basically accelerate your ability to make sense of it, whether that's machine learning to help you spot trends within your emissions, or whether that's using sort of natural language or Gen AI to query emissions data, so that way you don't have to build traditional reports. And then there's also GreenOps for AI. Obviously, AI is quite an expensive workload to run on public cloud, and then from a sustainability perspective, if it's expensive, it probably has quite a high emissions footprint. And so using GreenOps to help make sure you're getting the most value out of your AI investment is imperative.
Yeah, I think AI creates an interesting challenge because when we think about when the public cloud was first created, you took the procurement of servers and the electricity limitations out of the IT and procurement teams where they had to fill out a whole booklet of paperwork to be able to buy a new server, and put that in the hands of the engineers who just want to build stuff that is cool and quick and little latency and very performant. And now, as you say, FinOps is getting accelerated. Engineers are starting to understand the financial implications, and with GreenOps the sustainability implications. But then when you think about AI and these models, you're now putting the compute, shifting that even further left to your average Joe who will make Ghibli images all day and melt a GPU just because they have no visibility. And they care even less about the cost of these things than your average engineer.
It's brilliant because it's almost a real paradigm shift. I see people all the time getting really excited because you can just build applications now. You can use Cursor, or you can use loads of these new AI tools to help you write code and ship apps. And it's like, this is crazy. You no longer need to have gone and studied computer science or learnt a programming language to start writing code and building. And that's brilliant, right? It makes the pyramid of people that can come and work in technology even broader, and it removes some of those barriers to entry. But then from a GreenOps perspective, it means that more people are writing code, more people are building applications, there are more resources running. And so naturally there's going to be a downstream effect from that, which is the trend we're seeing in massive data center investments, where we need more servers to run these. Yes, you're abstracted away from that when you're using some form of Gen AI to help you write code, but fundamentally that piece of code is still going to be running on a server somewhere. Whether or not you have control of it, whether or not you're aware of that server, whether or not you know where that server is almost irrelevant. That code is still running somewhere. And so, yes, you could argue maybe we need to look at more sustainable programming languages to help make sure that when code runs, it is more efficient and consumes less energy. But if we're going to see a massive explosion in more people building and writing applications, we're probably going to see an explosion of equal proportions from a GreenOps perspective, where organizations then wake up and go, wow, our emissions have exploded.
Most of the time, if you give someone the option of which model to choose, they will pick the biggest, most fancy model, because why the hell not? Because they're not paying for it. You know, they've got their GPT subscription that gives them access to all of them, so I'm going to use the biggest one. But if you're able to surface the fact that GPT-4 Mini is like 15 times less energy intensive per token than 4.0 or 4.5, you know, is that the metric they needed to stop and rethink, do I need the biggest model every time? And that overlaps closely with FinOps, because the bigger the model, the more it charges as well. But if you're not putting policy in place or telling people about the impact of these choices they're making day to day, then why would they even bother looking at the smaller models? And, you know, like a typical sustainability and cost-saving initiative for AI is like choosing the small language models and not just unleashing the biggest one on all your data just because you can.
Thank you so much for joining me. I've really enjoyed having this conversation with you. It's always a pleasure to have GreenPixie here at Telefónica Tech. And thank you for listening to us talk about GreenOps and cloud sustainability as well. If you want to learn more about where to kickstart your GreenOps journey, then check out the Telefónica Tech GreenOps landing page, where we've got plenty more information about GreenOps and also where to get started.